Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Gospel of Luke. Glad you're joining us on YouTube for this study. I hope it is a time of learning and growth for you. I know that I've enjoyed assembling some of the material, and we're going to keep a pretty quick pace today, and hopefully this study is beneficial to you. I'll slide this on over, and we'll begin. Luke chapter 2. Like the first chapter, is a series of 4 scenes. You may recall that I emphasized the role that Luke plays as a historical narrative in the biblical text. Luke is a writing in the vein of a traditional Greek historian, and Greek historians didn't necessarily reduce things to simple facts in chronological order. They would tell a story. So it's more historical narrative, if you can think of it that way. Some would even argue that Luke's writing reflects more of perhaps a good phrase would be a novel, if you will, but a historical one, historically accurate one. Anyways, 4 scenes come out in the second chapter. There was 4 in the first chapter. There's 4 now here in the second, and we're going to take these one at a time. First scene, journey to Bethlehem. Second, angels and shepherds. Third, the presentation of Jesus at the temple at 8 days old. And then the fourth, which is Jesus at the temple, age 12. But begin with that first scene, which is the journey to Bethlehem. I have here a map that has 2 giant, I would call that a pink X, one in the north in Galilee, and the second is over the city of Bethlehem, which is just south and slightly west of the city of Jerusalem. Roughly 70 miles or so from Nazareth from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem of Judea. There were 2 major travel routes. One would be directly through Samaria. That was the fastest, shortest route. And then the second route would take you from Nazareth to the east to the Jordan River, and then south along the Jordan, and you would pass through the Decapolis through Perea, and then make your way to the city of Jericho. And then from Jericho begin the 3,000-foot ascent from the Jordan River Valley up to the hills of Judea, the hill country of Judea. Either route is possible. The biblical text doesn't tell us which route that is Mary and Joseph, took, but one of those 2. It's a challenging journey. I decided to take a couple of pictures that are notable, representations of that journey. The upper left is a modern interpretation. The lower left, a work of art that dates more from the 6th, I believe it was, or 7th century. And then on the far right, a painting coming to us from the 15th century. And as you can see, historically, Christians have taken great liberties with this event and have really sought to... Why did I freeze? Really sought to depict it in ways that reflect our modern society or our contemporary viewpoint. So you notice Mary and Joseph upper left, the modern rendition. You'll see that they are traveling alone, which is fascinating because that was highly unlikely. In the ancient world, you always sought to caravan with others because if you were in a group, you were not vulnerable to attack by bandits. And you may recall Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. The setting for that parable is a man journeying from Jerusalem to Jericho. That hill country and ravines were a haunt for robbers. And so had Mary and Joseph taken that route, just the 2 of them, almost assured that they would have been mugged somewhere along the way. So that rendition of them traveling alone, highly unlikely. But you may recall, or may notice in the far right, rendition, the one dating from the 15th century, 14th century. That rendition, of course, we see Mary is seated astride a horse, a white gallant horse with lots of regalia, because, again, that's how a Anglo-Saxon interpretation would go. And then in the lower left, you'll notice from the ancient world, again, the idea that she rode a horse because this particular artwork comes from the Eastern Orthodox tradition. and they all rode horses. So each of them contributes in their own way to their own perspective or take, depending on culture and history of whoever is depicting this travel. But I just want to throw us out there just simply so that we understand we fill in the blanks with our culture when, in fact, the biblical text never really specifies any of these details. Luke provides some historical points of reference. In those days, Caesar Augustus issues a decree of a census of the whole Roman world. This census is unique because it is the whole Roman world. There were several other census taken, but they were always on a far smaller scale. So this is a empire-wide census. Quirinius is governor of Syria. The fact that Luke cites that rather than Herod, king in Judea, is probably in keeping with the fact that Theophilus and most likely Luke were more Syrian. We have reason to believe that Luke hailed from the city of Antioch. It's possible Theophilus likewise was from Syria. And so referencing a Syrian governor makes sense giving Luke's audience. Citing a Jewish king would make no sense if, in fact, Theophilus is Syrian. So that's the most likely reason for that citation. Luke's point is simply that these are the historical events that brought about the birth of Jesus in the city of Bethlehem, which, of course, is the city of David. Luke stresses the ingloriousness of Jesus' earthly birth and the circumstances surrounding his birth, emphasizing it took place in an inn. He was laid in a manger, which is a feeding trough. This is not the way one would expect royalty to be born. And it fits with one of Luke's primary teaching objectives, and that is to state that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will in fact be exalted in the end. So that inversion of values, which runs very contrary to the Roman society, and we'll see this more in chapter 2, in the second scene, we'll see this occur as well, as Luke portrays the shepherds. Anyways, moving to that second scene, to shepherds. This is a couple of pictures of what the hills country of Judea looks like. It is very arid. It is very rocky. The ancient world, much like the modern world, you take your poor soils, poor regions for cultivation, you use them generally for livestock. If it was more rich, fertile soil, flatter, less rocky, better rainfall, more consistent rainfall, it would have been cultivated fields of grain and other things, and orchards and groves of olives and figs and so forth. The hill country of Judea is pretty rocky, pretty hilly, pretty inhospitable for most agricultural purposes. Therefore, it was left for livestock, for grazing. Because of this nomadic lifestyle, given the wet and rainy seasons that this part of the world experiences, shepherds again lived pretty nomadic lifestyles, and therefore bounced about quite a bit. Because of this nomadic lifestyle, they were generally seen as kind of on the fringe of society. If you go back to the 17th, 18th century and the reputation that preceded sailors as kind of lewd, crude, outcast, because of their transient lifestyle and their behaviors and so forth, that was kind of the reputation one that would follow shepherds. And so the fact that Luke introduces shepherds as those who are greeted by the angelic messengers, again, highlights this principle that Luke keeps driving at. God reveals himself to the humble. God reveals himself to the marginal. And you'll see that as a second bullet point beneath here in the second scene. Here Luke gives insight. God embraces the marginal. That becomes a drumbeat that you'll find throughout Luke and in some regard to Acts as well. God does not give any consideration to the things that mankind give consideration to. A Roman society is a power-grabbing, glory-seeking, self-aggrandizement society, and that runs so contrary to the biblical text. God doesn't care about titles. God doesn't care about prominence. God doesn't care about who you're, what role you have or what title you have. God cares about marginals, and he cares about everyone. And that becomes, as I said, a consistent theme in Luke's writing. Notice the glory in heaven that is displayed in this second scene. Great company of the heavenly host singing, glory to God in the highest. Again, we see that contrast. There is earthly humility contrasted with heavenly glory. For the Christian, we expect this life to be a humbling experience. We expect to live through it as servants and as foreigners, as aliens, if you will. And we see glorification occurring in our life, or in our preview of that which is to come in eternity. We think that glory waits till we're crowned and we live in eternity, and then we get to partake in God's glory. We don't seek that now. We anticipate it as a delayed gratification coming down the road, and that's how Luke portrays it. There's humility on earth, Jesus being placed in a cattle trough, and yet we know that he is the Lord of that heavenly host. So there's humility now, there's glorification future. True for the Christ child, and true for Christ followers. Moving now to the third scene, Luke introduces Jesus now as 8 days old and being dedicated at the temple. I just want to throw out this picture very quickly. The front is the east gate, which is called the Golden Gate. There would have been a valley that stretched from this Golden Gate down across what we know as the Kidron Valley, and then it goes across over to the Mount of Olives. So when you stand in the church parking lot, this is a good approximation. If you stand in the church parking lot and look south and a little bit east, you can look across 169 and you see a hill, tailings pile opposite the church, sometimes referred to as local as Dead Man's. That's about the size of the Kidron Valley, just 100 or 200 yards across, and the Mount of Olives sat opposite that. And so the temple faced east, and Jesus would have been brought by his parents, most likely through the Golden Gate, up to the courtyard of the women, and to the first divider, which is the court of Israel. And there would have been a series of steps that led from there up towards the altar, and most people came there, were met by a priest, and would have given their gift to the priest to take for them to the altar. Now, it is there in that courtyard of the women that they are greeted by Anna and Simon, two figures who, by the Spirit of God, have been told that they will behold the Christ child before their death, and when they spot Mary and Joseph bringing in Jesus, identify him as the Christ child. So again, key pieces here. We have Holy Spirit revealing to godly people the identity of Christ. We need to remember that in Luke's presentation of the gospel, he emphasizes, sometimes to a larger degree than other New Testament writers like Paul, for instance, Luke emphasizes the role of the Spirit in regeneration. There is not conversion apart from God's Spirit revealing who he is. Later on in Luke's gospel, we'll read of the scene in which Jesus professes that Jesus is in fact the Christ, the Son of the living God, and Jesus commends him and says to Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon Peter, for this is not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." That speaks to this idea that the Spirit is an essential ingredient in the regeneration of souls. There cannot be divine new life apart from the act of the Spirit. We can therefore present the gospel in a orderly or meaningful way, but it really requires an act of the Spirit. And this is one of the ways in which Luke and Paul are coming at it differently. Paul often talks about how salvation works. Luke centers on who brings about salvation. So Paul can frame the legal arguments of how salvation mechanically works, Christ taking the place of sinful man, the innocent in exchange for the guilty. And that gets to the mechanical of how that works. But it's Luke who really drives at the who of this, the work of God, the work of Christ, and the work of the Spirit. It's who that really occupies Luke's attention. And that is, in fact, the Spirit that gives new life, the Spirit of Jesus that gives new life. In Simon's prayer or song of praise, he highlights that this child is going to be light to the Gentiles and glory to Israel. That phrase, light to Gentiles, speaks to their ignorance of who God is and ignorance of what moral purity looks like, and Christ is going to convey that to the Gentile world. And he's going to come and bring glory to Israel because he will establish in time the throne of David. And so those become key pieces as we see the gospel in later parts of Acts in later part of Luke and then into the book of Acts the gospel going to the Gentiles, and in fact does the message of Jesus become light to the Gentiles. And as we look at the eschatological pieces that Luke does talk about in his gospel account and in the book of Acts, we get a feel for that Jesus who in fact will be the glory of Israel as he comes and reestablishes the kingdom. In the fourth scene, we have the return of Jesus to the temple. Going back a couple, Jesus was on a normal pilgrimage. It was normative for Jewish people to every year make a pilgrimage to the holy city, to visit the temple, to offer sacrifices and so forth. And while they're there, Jesus decides to stick around, and Mary and Joseph take off, find themselves several hours, perhaps a day later, looking for Jesus, not able to find him, only to go back to Jerusalem, a city that's tens of thousands of people, frantically searching for him, only to find that he is, in fact, in the temple. They question him, how could you do this? And as a parent, you can understand the franticness that this would cause as a child. Leaving you is probably, and getting lost in a large crowd is one of the greatest fears a parent can have. And Jesus' response is that they should have known he would be in his Father's house. This is the first time where Jesus makes a clear profession of his identity as the Son of God. He makes the profession. Up until this time, it's the angel, and I'll bring up my final concluding slide here because it's important. This is down under Jesus' identity as the Son of God is established. At his birth, it's the angels who tell the shepherds he's the Christ. At his consecration at the temple, it's Anna and Simon who tell Mary and Joseph, this is the Christ. It's at age 12 that Jesus tells his parents, I am the Son of God. This is my Father's house. And so those themes build together to demonstrate that Jesus' divinity is going to be clearly and emphatically established in the Gospel of Luke. So Theophilus, you're supposed to get that God exists, that God invites people to trust in him, have faith in him, because he is a person who is himself faithful to his promises, as we looked at last week, and that we are to trust him as a means of salvation. And the one that we are trusting in is the person of Christ, Messiah, Jesus, who is the Son of God. So it kind of lays it out that way. God exists. God invites us to be responsive in faith. Faith is necessary for salvation. Salvation comes about when we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. So very basic elements of the gospel already in play by the time we get through the second chapter of the Gospel of Luke. So Luke's gospel again highlights the marginal. We're going to keep coming back to that theme. We're keep coming back to that theme of God exalting the humble, and keep coming back to this idea that salvation comes about by an act of the Spirit. So as an evangelical, a Christian in the 21st century, as we look at Luke's gospel message, and again, I hope that I'm putting together this in a way that makes sense to you all. Keep your eye on the main themes. Keep first things first. Again, Luke is going to construct his gospel in historical narrative, and he's going to keep developing these scenes, and you have to understand that each scene is there for a reason. Each scene is going to convey theological truth. So you need to be asking yourself, what's the truth that's conveyed in this scene that Luke is giving us? Hopefully, as you read through the second chapter, what I've shared here, the layout I've given you, proves very insightful and helpful. So you can really grab hold of how the text is being assembled. And again, keep remembering that Luke is writing to an audience of one. He's writing to Theophilus. He's writing to a Gentile who perhaps is familiar with the faith, perhaps is himself a nominal believer, perhaps is a believer, but just doesn't have a clear understanding of all of what the scriptures teach. And so Luke is just coming back to very basic elements and reaffirming them, but doing so with historical narrative. So reaffirming the idea that faith matters by demonstrating the faith that Mary has in contrast to the questioning and doubt of Zechariah. Showing that salvation comes about by putting trust in Christ. Demonstrating that we need a revelation from God to know who Christ is, as we see in the case of Ananias or Anna, excuse me, and Simon. So those are the themes that are moving. You're going to see this develop more and more as we get into the third and fourth chapters, and Jesus' ministry really starts to take off. Until then, we're just kind of laying foundational pieces that set the groundwork for Jesus' ministry. And as Acts takes off and Luke comes to a close, we'll see that that ministry that Jesus inaugurates gets passed on to his followers, to the disciples. So that's how it fits together. Hopefully this is making sense and is beneficial for your time of study. If you have questions, always feel free to reach out to me. Love questions and love to answer them. And I hope that you continue to study, learn, and grow from this wonderful gospel account. So blessings and prayer are with you. May God bless your time of study. And again, if you have questions, just let me know. Thanks for being a part of this study.